Hi, my name is Stezka. Today I'm going to show you how I made a pair of Fennec fox ears and a tail to go with them. I started by creating a pattern. I made the base out of 2mm craft foam, but I was planning to use felt on the inside of the ears. My felt pieces were smaller than the foam, so I had to use the dimensions of the felt to figure out how big the ears would be. In retrospect, I should have used Minky for the inside of the ears, which I plan to use on all future projects. This would have resulted in a nicer, softer ear, as well as prevented any sizing limitations. I created a pattern, traced it onto the foam, and cut out the foam pieces. I then hot glued wires to the base of the ears so that they could be bent around and maintain a realistic three-dimensional shape. Then I took the ear pattern, traced it onto the felt, and cut that out as well. Time to move on to fur. Still using my pattern, I cut pieces out of brown fur. Make sure the fur is laying in the direction you want it to. For ears, the fur should go from the base towards the tips of the ears. These ears have a black tuft on the tips, so I cut the space for that piece out of the brown pieces. Once I had the pieces cut out, I used my clippers to shave them down. I'm using a variable length blade at the longest it will go, but I would recommend watching some other tutorials for recommendations on what specific blade length to use. Once the ears were shaved, I cut the tufts out of black fur. I left those pieces at their normal length so that they would stick out farther than the rest of the fur. I hand-stitched the tufts to the brown fur with a blanket stitch with black thread. Once the tufts were sewn on, I began to attach the felt. I placed the felt on the fur side, and once again I used a blanket stitch. Once I had sewn all the way around the edge of the ear, I turned the ear inside out to create a sort of sleeve that would slide over the foam base. After I turned it out, however, I noticed one of the reasons that I should have used Minky. The seam was very visible and even looked like it could be easily ripped out of the felt. I slid the foam into the ear and did my best to cover as much of one side of the foam as I could with hot glue. Then I glued the hole at the base of the ear shut and touched up some of the trimming. Then I bent the ears into shape and prepared to glue them to the headband. I bought a fabric-covered headband so that the hot glue would adhere to it. I glued the ears down in two places so that they would stay attached, but the wearer could still adjust the wires in the ear if they wanted to. After each ear was glued in place, I used the hot glue gun to close the open end of the fur at the base. Now that the ears are done, it's time to make the tail. I figured out the basic dimensions that I wanted and cut out a piece of paper that size. I then drew a basic tail shape and cut it out. After that, I drew the stripes. At first I drew 6 stripes, but I redid the pattern and decided that 5 stripes looked better, as did the friend that I was making this for. I traced the pattern twice onto brown fur, making sure the fur was laying in the right direction. Once I had both brown pieces, I cut the stripes out of the pattern. I then used the pieces between the stripes to trace onto one of the brown fur pieces. I numbered each section so that I could make sure I put the pieces back in the same order, and then I cut them out. Next, I took the stripe patterns and traced them onto a piece of gray fur. Again, I made sure the direction of the fur was the same, and I numbered the stripes as well so that the pieces would match up when I sewed them to the tail. Once they were traced on, I cut them out. I lined up my pieces of fur so that they were all in the right place, and I started to sew them together. I sewed the tail by hand, and I used blanket stitch. I feel like hand stitching works better for detail work, but if you plan to do something like this with a machine, make sure you add seam allowance while you're tracing your patterns before you cut your fur. I also covered each of the stripe seams in a little bit of hot glue, just to give them a bit of extra strength and longevity. Once all of the stripes were sewn in, I pinned the edges of the tail together. Then I took it to my sewing machine and stitched the side seams. I was stitching very close to the edge of my fabric, but if you use a bigger seam allowance, it will make sewing easier. Just make sure you trim it down before you turn it out. I turned the tail right side out and stuffed it with polyfill. Once I was satisfied with how full it was, I added 2 pieces of elastic to function as belt loops, and stitched them into the top edge, closing the hole. And that's it! That's how I made a pair of Fennec fox ears and a tail to go with them. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you found it useful, leave a like. If you want to see more tutorials like this, I'm about to start working on my first full fursuit, so consider subscribing if you want to see how that goes. Once again, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!